Now we move on to RFK, Robert, which is it's the more he talks, the more it becomes clear why MSM doesn't want to let him talk, why Joe Biden will never sit down and debate with him. He was on Reason. I know I've read some articles from Reason. I don't know who the two individuals who interviewed him are. They purport to be libertarians, and I'm not going to immediately write someone off for an eternity because of what I think was a very bad interview. And they came in with uncritical premises for a lot of criticism against RFK. So if you know more about the two interviewers, let us know afterwards. But when you explain this, but the bottom line, they came out and it's as though it was a setup to smear RFK. Invoking reports of his speeches, which are not getting coverage or which are getting suppressed, to suggest he's a conspiracy nut, anti-vaxxer nut, and everything he says to the contrary. He did very well in this particular case. One thing which I know we've talked about was when the guy Weiss Mueller, who says, I believe that the vaccine saved a lot of lives, and here's some CDC data showing the deaths and how he did this with a number of the vaccines, MMR, or he did it with polio, showing how polio vaccine gets patented, gets administered, and cases drop off the charts. But then there's, flare-ups in unvaccinated communities, and RFK comes in and says, whoa, which communities were those vaccine strains of polio? As relates to the CDC data confirming that, unvaccinated deaths, RFK says, whoa, the deaths that they're including in unvaccinated are within, are of those who received one or two jabs but were not deemed to be fully vaccinated. And so you are in all likelihood getting deaths that are in fact adverse reactions being qualified as unvaccinated deaths. What's your take on all of it, Robert? And is RFK Jr. just right in what he says?
Yeah, what's extraordinary is, I've never been a big fan of Reason, never been a big fan of most institutional libertarians, because in my experience, they're just the right's version of left woke politics, that they're equally driven by selfish narcissism. And again, for those people out there, I'm not referencing all actual people who call themselves libertarian, not referring to Dave Smith or Thomas Woods or any of those people. I'm talking about a lot of the Libertarian Party higher-ups over time, the Cato Institute, and Reason Magazine, which is heavily funded by the Koch brothers. And so it was interesting that Robert Kennedy sat down and talked with him. Because he's been particularly critical of the Koch brothers over time. So, but that's his willingness to talk to anybody. But what was really dishonest and disingenuous about it was the interviewer who actually follows me on Twitter. But his reporting was the worst, because he kept repeating afterwards that Robert Kennedy had no answers for him. It was because he wasn't listening to Robert Kennedy's actual answers. But here's an example of how bad. We'll just take one analysis to debunk, which is he puts up the CDC chart. And what he makes the claim of is he says this chart proves beyond any question, beyond any controversy, beyond any dispute, that the COVID vaccine was safe and effective and it saved a bunch of lives. The problem is the chart doesn't even purport to say that. So problem number one with his analysis is he takes so-called libertarian free minds questioning authority. He takes at face value a chart produced by the CDC. And it's like a CDC that has been caught lying over and over and over again concerning the COVID vaccine. A CDC that tried to hide its actual data from a FOIA suit for 85 years. A CDC that we know lied about COVID death certificates. We know lied about the transmissibility of the vaccine. So that's problem one, right? Yeah, that's the chart he's showing. So problem one is he just takes, this has got to be gospel. It's the CDC. It's like, what a crock as a libertarian. What a crock as a thinker. They tend to be that have the same arrogant professional class prejudice of their woke brethren. There's Robbie Suave. There's a bunch of these people that are this way. That's problem number one. Problem number two with the chart is he thinks this is a safety chart. It's not. It doesn't even purport to be. This is an efficacy chart. And what Robert Kennedy's explaining to them over and over again is there's a difference between safety and efficacy. Efficacy tells you, if I take this particular drug, what's the likelihood it will prevent the particular disease that drug is meant to prevent? By contrast, safety looks at, if I take this drug, What's the overall effect on my health? Because, oh, now I don't die of COVID. Instead, I die of a heart attack. Well, if the ordinary person is like, okay, I'm not interested in taking something that decreases my overall health. But this dimwit doesn't even understand that. He doesn't know the difference between safety and efficacy. So that's problem number 2. Problem number 3 is, which he should be immediately skeptical of, given that CDC is the source, is how are they defining COVID deaths? Right? I mean, there we know that they were deliberately manipulating death certificates to, in some cases, inflate, in other cases, deflate the number of COVID identified deaths. He doesn't. So it's an unreliable chart, not only because of the source, but because of what they were doing as to this specific chart. Then you have problem number 4. He doesn't know, and this is the irony. Earlier in the interview, Robert Kennedy points out that the excess mortality charts around the globe show a direct correlation between when a country got mass vaccination and all of a sudden a spike in their excess death ratios. And this libertarian guy, this reason guy, this reason without reason, that's what they should rename the publication, says, oh, well, we would need to be able to compare the underlying demographics to be able to know whether these were like-to-like comparisons. But he fails to employ the exact same methodology when it comes to a chart that he likes. Because as Robert Kennedy points out, in an answer somehow this guy was too deaf to hear, how are they defining vaccinated? Because what he doesn't know is there's 2 major problems here. Problem 1 is they were defining people who took the shot and then died from it as unvaccinated, unless it happened it got to a certain length of time after the vaccination.
2 weeks after the second shot is when they're considered.
Shot. Yeah. So basically, all these people they were killing early. Oh, look at all these unvaccinated people who are suddenly dying, and the giveaway is right there in the chart. Why is there this suddenly big surge after the vaccine is introduced? Right? I mean, look at that big jump. Well, why is that big jump there? I mean, if there's really a difference in COVID on vaccinated versus unvaccinated, then the long part of the chart should continue to show a big disparity. But you don't. It happens at the beginning. Why is that? Because that big spike is a bunch of vaccinated people who died after they took the shot.
Robert, stop one there. Let me just go here and I want to make sure that actually sounds correct.
There's a second component to that surge, and it also goes to the definition of unvaccinated. What he talks about is like versus like earlier. He's like, well, in order to know whether a graph is correct, we need to know, are you comparing 25-year-old healthy, no comorbidity men, for example, said. Risk stratification, individualization. They didn't do that here because what he didn't ask, it's the second reason for that early surge, is why were some people unvaccinated? And there was one key problem all along with these data is there are a bunch of people who are unvaccinated because they couldn't be. In other words, these are people, why could they not be? Because their health is so bad. So part of it is that early surge is also part of people who are already near dead, who couldn't get vaccination. And so that's where that's the other reason for that. And that's where you look at like March 2022, there's almost no difference between the two groups, right? And then it varies. And then again, he's only comparing so-called CDC identified COVID deaths, which is not even right as to COVID deaths. But the relevant chart you'd want to see here is excess mortality by relevant category of like versus like. He doesn't even know that that's what you need to look at, even though Robert Kennedy tells him earlier in the interview, if you look at those charts, they overwhelmingly show, people want to get the book Robert Kennedy co-authored, Died Suddenly, I think with Edward Dowd and some other folks. He has all the charts and data, including from government sources, big universities like Johns Hopkins, these kind of sources. When you look at excess mortality rates, because that's what you want to know. If I take this drug, am I going to be healthy or not? And for that, you don't care just about your risk from COVID. You care about anything the drug may cause a problem for. And this is the other thing Robert Kennedy details. Robert Kennedy goes and explains, look, what we're figuring out is all these vaccinations weaken the immune system over time. Not getting certain viruses and diseases early in life actually weakens the system over time. And he's like, we're seeing all of these maybe unintended consequences, but still consequences we can now witness. And he doesn't understand any of it. He can't even process it because he just swallows the propaganda and spits it back out. Swallows the propaganda, spits it back out.
And I'm just sitting here trying to actually steel man what could be the explanation for that spike. Like you say, Robert, that was, I just wanted to double check the timeline. That's November-ish, maybe a little later.
Yeah, it starts.
That's
I mean,
oh,
the peak
that's
is, I think, around January and February, right when the vaccine is mass
well,
introduced into the United States.
but and if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, that's right when Omicron was taking over, and Omicron was the less lethal, the more dilute, the less lethal version of the Rona, and so that couldn't
And
even be the explanation.
some part of that is a big group of that surge are people that were just about to die anyway who couldn't be vaccinated because of how bad their health was. But they deliberately knew we're going to stick in the unvaccinated, people who are unusually unhealthy, and people who actually were vaccinated but died before a certain time period of the second shot. Why? Because they knew from Pfizer's own data, which, that nitwit libertarian guy in the middle ignored. Robert Kennedy explained to them, look at Pfizer's own study, which we got from the FOIA suit. The Pfizer's own study showed excess mortality. More people died who took the vaccine than who took the placebo. So they knew that at the CDC. So they're like, we got to manipulate the data. We got to manipulate how we measure COVID deaths. We got to manipulate who we stick in unvaccinated. And by doing those two things, they could come up with a fake chart that also ignores excess mortality in general, which is
Now,
the only standard we all care about.
now I don't want to say in fairness because it even there's no fairness to be applied here. It is true that there were more deaths in the unvaccinated group, but the numbers were very marginal in any event because you were dealing with such limited testing. So it was
And
like,
if you look at like versus like, the death rate, as Robert Kennedy points out, this guy somehow also ignores. Said Robert Kennedy had no answers. No, he kept giving you answers you didn't like and didn't want to hear. If you look at like versus, in other words, if you look at people who faced very low risk from COVID, which is about 90% of the population, for that group, the vaccine has already been net negative in terms of their overall health. And that doesn't even factor in that the big risk of this vaccine is long tail risk, is risk that's expected to happen 5, 10, 15 years from now. And so that's where the vaccine was an utter disaster and debacle. He also gets a lot of other stuff wrong. Like he cites, here's the World Health Organization. We can't question them. They put out a chart. It must be God's word. It came down like the 10 Commandments from Mount Sinai. I mean, Mr. Libertarian, Mr. Free Thinker, Mr. Independent Questioner. And the doesn't realize that they have looked at that in great detail. As Robert Kennedy details, he says the CDC looked at this and figured out that all of the past vaccines that are praised, almost all of them had nothing to do with the reduction of the disease. How do we know that? Because in countries where they didn't even have the vaccine, there was a massive comparable decline in the disease. It related to sanitation in general and health standards improving more broadly. It turns out when you don't have sewage outside your front door every day, that your disease transmission goes down. That was what it is. And the CDC, and he details it, and he pretends he didn't listen to it. He's still running around telling people on social media, Robert Kennedy had no answers. Robert Kennedy had no answers. No, dimwit, you didn't have any answers.
and I was laughing when you said, you're going to find out 5, 10, 15 years later. And every time, like my heart hurts, Robert, when you say that. Like, all right, I'm part of the experiment now.
Yeah, well, maybe you got apparently it's increasingly clear. Like there's certain batches, big problems, other batches, no problems. And in Europe, it appears the batches with no problems were Celine's, but they were not even the actual vaccine. Up to 1/3, according to recent studies, not yet confirmed, but already out there, from some reasonable sources, that up to 1/3, maybe more, didn't actually get the vaccine. So even the drug companies were so nervous about it, they didn't even send it out to everybody.
Oh, is the theory that it was deliberately saline or that it was just inert?
Yeah, deliberately.
Huh?
Yeah, well, maybe that's good for you. Maybe you got the saline.
All that I know is I did do the bad batch search on my dose number, and there was virtually nil. But it's I hesitate with my words in terms of what repercussions there should be, but there at least has to be a trial. Now, there was actually one other thing. So the unvaccinated deaths is a very valid point in that they are including everyone who might have had up to 2 shots but died before the 2 weeks after their second shot, and they lump those into unvaccinated deaths. The polio argument I have heard multiple times where they say, look, polio dropped off. It coincides with the vaccination program, but it also probably more coincides with hygiene, all this other stuff. But
and that's where Robert Kennedy kept coming back to the same point. He's like, let's look at all health data for vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Let's look at that across the world. The CDC is so terrified of what that will show that they refuse to fund that study. But there's about 75 such studies out there around the globe. And so far, every single one shows the fewer vaccines you got, the healthier you got by almost every major health metric. And that's what they can't refute. And like he talks about that in the show, and they just pretend they didn't hear it. I mean, he's an example of how libertarian independent media is just co-opted. Like, it was no surprise the Libertarian Party in 2020 was for lockdowns, right? Can you imagine the Libertarian Party for lockdowns? That's how, because they've been co-opted by the professional class, who are a bunch of selfish narcissists whose only consistency is they get to do what they want to do. That's about it. Unless it involves the professional class, and then they're on the same professional class parade that the professional class is on, whether it's affirmative action or immigration or a range of other policies. But it was an embarrassing interview by Reason for how unreasoned it was.
Everyone should watch it, and prepare to get frustrated. It's frustrating, but RFK, he needs to debate somebody who's an actual expert who can debunk what RFK says in real time, but nobody wants to do it. So
it's because they can't. That's why they had to do it the way he did it here, where he ambushes them, ambushes RFK, then he ignores RFK. And that's the whole process. He can't, a moderated debate, that guy gets crushed because, he's another example of how many dumb people have positions of power in America.